Commander Zexthara pressed her 4 hands against the cold metal walls of the escape pod and tried not to think about dying. The small space around her was barely big enough for one person, and the air already tasted stale. Through the tiny window, she could see nothing but stars and empty space stretching forever in all directions. Her blue skin felt cold despite the pod's heating system working at full power. She touched the scales along her neck with one hand while using another to check the life support readings on the small screen beside her. The numbers were not good. Oxygen would last maybe 18 hours if she stayed calm and did not move around too much. Zexthara had been a proud officer in the Calarian Republic Navy for 20 years. She had commanded exploration ships that traveled to distant worlds and discovered new things that helped her people grow stronger. The mission to Kepler 442c was supposed to be another routine survey of a dead planet that had been empty for thousands of years, but they found something amazing buried deep under the planet's surface. Ancient ruins that held technology beyond anything the Calarians had ever seen. The machines were still working after all these years, and the data they contained could change everything about how ships traveled between the stars. Captain Veltar had been so excited when they made the discovery. He ordered the science teams to work day and night to copy all the information they could find. Zexthara remembered how his eyes had glowed with pride as he talked about how this would make the Calarian Republic the strongest power in the galaxy. Everything changed when the hegemony ships appeared. The enemy fleet dropped out of hyperspace like hungry predators smelling blood. 15 massive warships against one small exploration vessel. Captain Veltar had maybe 10 minutes to make a choice that would decide who lived and who died. Zexthara closed her eyes and remembered those terrible final moments on the bridge. The captain's voice had been steady as he gave his orders, but she could see the fear in his eyes. The exploration data was too valuable to lose. It had to reach Calarian space no matter what happened to the crew. Launch all escape pods, the captain had said. Scatter them across the system. Maybe some will survive long enough to be rescued. The words had hit Zexthara like a physical blow. She knew what he really meant. The ship would run for home with the precious data while the crew was left behind to die slowly in space. The escape pods had limited power and no faster than light engines. They could only drift and hope someone would find them before the air ran out. 13 pods had been launched in those final moments before the ship jumped to hyperspace. Zexthara had watched through her window as her home for the past 3 years disappeared in a flash of blue light. Captain Veltar and the skeleton crew he kept with him were probably already halfway back to Calarian space. The other pods had been visible for the first few hours. Small metal dots reflecting starlight as they drifted apart from each other. One by one, their emergency beacons had gone silent. Either the power cells had failed or the people inside had already died. Zexthara tried not to think about which option was worse. She activated the small recorder built into the pod's wall and began to speak. Her words would be transmitted on the emergency frequency that all Calarian ships monitored. Maybe someone would hear her final message even if they arrived too late to save her. This is Commander Zexthara of the exploration vessel Starfall. My ship was attacked by hegemony forces in the Kepler 442 system. The crew was evacuated in escape pods, but we have no rescue ships in this area. If anyone receives this message, please know that we discovered something important on the 4th planet, ancient technology that could change everything for our people. She paused and looked out at the stars again. So many worlds out there, and most of them were controlled by species that the Calarians had never bothered to understand. The humans were the worst of all. Primitive creatures who had barely learned to travel between stars. They lived on dirty worlds and built ugly ships that looked like they were made from scrap metal. The Calarian Republic had sent diplomats to Earth many years ago. The reports they brought back described a species that was violent and unpredictable. Humans fought wars over resources they could easily share and seemed to enjoy conflict for its own sake. They had no real culture or art that civilized beings could appreciate. Most disturbing of all was how humans treated their own kind. The diplomatic reports were full of stories about humans who would risk their lives to save complete strangers. They would jump into dangerous situations to help people they had never met and expect nothing in return. Such behavior made no logical sense to Calarian minds. The Galactic Council had debated for years about whether humans should be allowed to join civilized society. Most species voted to keep them isolated in their own small section of space. Let them fight among themselves and leave the important work of running the galaxy to more advanced civilizations. Zexthara had always agreed with that decision. Humans were too chaotic and emotional to be trusted with real responsibility. They made decisions based on feelings instead of logic, and that made them dangerous to everyone around them. Now, as she drifted alone in the darkness, she wondered if any ship would bother to investigate their distress signals. The hegemony certainly would not help. They would probably kill any survivors they found just to make sure no information about the ancient ruins ever reached Calarian space. Other species might detect the emergency beacons, but would they care enough to mount a rescue mission? Most civilized races calculated the cost of helping against the benefits they might receive. Saving a few Calarian officers would bring no profit and might even create problems with the hegemony. The humans were the only ones who might be foolish enough to attempt a rescue. Their ships sometimes patrolled this area of space even though they had no real business being here. But humans were also the least capable of fighting off hegemony warships if they tried to interfere. Zexthara checked the life support readings again and saw that her time was running shorter than expected. The pod's recycling system was working harder than it should, and that meant something was damaged. Maybe she had 12 hours left instead of 18. She recorded another message and then settled back to wait for the end. The stars looked the same as they always had, but now they seemed cold and distant instead of beautiful. Soon she would join all the other beings who had died alone in the empty spaces between worlds. The silence pressed against her ears like a physical weight, and she tried not to count the minutes as they slowly passed by. Captain Jake Morrison was drinking his morning coffee when Lieutenant Amy Rodriguez called from the communications station. The bridge of the UES Defiant was quiet during the early shift, and most of the crew was still waking up. Jake liked these peaceful moments before the day really began. "Captain, we have something strange on the long-range sensors," Amy said. Her voice carried that tone that meant she had found something interesting. After 3 years working together, Jake knew all of Amy's different ways of speaking. Jake walked over to her station and looked at the display screen. Green dots and lines showed the surrounding space for several light years in every direction. Most of it was empty except for a few asteroids and the usual background radiation that filled the universe. "What am I looking at, Rodriguez?" Jake asked. Amy pointed to a cluster of very faint signals near the edge of their sensor range. "Emergency beacons, sir. Multiple contacts in the Kepler 442 system. The signal pattern matches Calarian Republic. Emergency protocols, but they are very weak." Jake studied the readouts more carefully. The Calarian system was not friendly territory for human ships. The blue-skinned aliens had made it very clear over the years that they considered humans too the barely civilized barbarians who should stay in their own space. "How weak are we talking about?" Jake asked. "Based on the power levels, I would estimate maybe 15 hours before complete failure. Could be less if the pods are damaged." Dr. Lisa Bennett had been walking by and stopped when she heard the conversation. The chief medical officer was one of Jake's oldest friends and had served with him since his first command. She raised an eyebrow and gave him that look that meant she was thinking the same thing he was. "Calarians, Jake," Lisa said. "They have made it pretty clear they do not want our help with anything. Remember the last diplomatic meeting when their ambassador called us mentally defective primates?" Jake nodded, but his mind was already working on the problem. The Calarian Republic had always treated humans with barely hidden contempt. Their diplomats spoke to Earth representatives like adults talking to small children who could not understand important concepts most human captains would probably ignore. The distress signals and file a report when they got back to base. Let the Calarians handle their own problems. After all, they had never offered to help humans when ships went missing in dangerous parts of space, but Jake had never been like most captains. His father had been a rescue pilot who spent his career pulling people out of burning buildings and crashed vehicles. The old man had always said that decent people help others regardless of whether they deserve it or not. Amy, how long to reach the Kepler 442 system at maximum burn? Jake asked. The lieutenant checked her navigation computer and ran some quick calculations. Approximately 14 hours, sir. We would arrive with maybe an hour to spare if my estimates are correct. Navigator Paul Carter looked up from his station with concern written across his face. Captain, we would be crossing into disputed territory. That whole area has been claimed by both the Calarian Republic and the Hegemony. If either side has ships in the system, we could be walking into a fight. Jake understood Paul's worries. The young officer had only been on the Defiant for 6 months and was still learning how his captain made decisions. The Hegemony were known for shooting first and asking questions later when they found ships in areas they considered their own. Sir, the regulations say we should contact Fleet Command before entering potentially hostile space, Paul continued. Getting permission could take hours and those people might be dead by then. Chief Engineer Tony Phillips had joined the group around the communications station. The gruff older man had been fixing starship engines longer than some of the crew. Had been alive. He scratched his beard and looked at the sensor readings. Captain, those pods are definitely Calarian design, Tony said. Pretty advanced life support systems, but they are not built for long-term survival. If people are still alive in there, they will not be for much longer. Jake looked around at his crew and saw the same conflict in all their faces. Nobody wanted to risk their ship and lives for aliens who had never shown them any kindness. But nobody wanted to let people die in space either when they had the power to help. Lisa, what do you know about Calarian physiology? Jake asked. If we pick up survivors, can you keep them alive? The doctor pulled up medical files on her tablet and scrolled through information about alien biology. I have theoretical knowledge but no practical experience. Their blood chemistry is different from humans and they need higher oxygen levels. I could probably improvise treatments if needed. Jake made his decision the way he always did, by asking himself what kind of person he wanted to be when he looked in the mirror each morning. The answer was always the same. Set course for Kepler 442 maximum burn, he ordered. Amy, send a message to Fleet Command informing them of our intentions. Paul, plot the fastest route and try to avoid any known patrol areas. Tony nodded and headed for the engine room. I will get you every bit of speed this old girl can manage, Captain. Lisa went to prepare the medical bay while the bridge crew began making preparations for what could be a very dangerous mission. Jake stood in the center of the bridge and watched stars start to move on the main screen as his ship changed course. Sir, are you sure about this? Paul asked quietly. The Calarians have never done anything for humanity. Some people would say, we should let them solve their own problems. Jake thought about his father and all the people the old man had saved during his career. Fire did not care about the politics or nationality of the people trapped inside burning buildings. Rescue workers went in anyway because that was what decent human beings did. Paul, when someone is dying in space, there are no politics, Jake said. There are just people who need help and people who can provide it. We do not abandon anyone to die alone, no matter what they think of us. The young navigator seemed to understand and turned back to his station with new determination. Jake could see the same change in all his crew members as they prepared for the mission. This was why he was proud to be human and proud to serve with these people. The Defiant was not the biggest or most advanced ship in the fleet. Her hull was scarred from previous battles and her systems were older than those on newer vessels. But Jake would rather command this crew than any other group of people in the galaxy. Amy, keep monitoring those signals, Jake ordered. Let me know immediately if any of them go silent. Tony, I need every bit of speed you can give me without blowing the engines. Lisa, make sure medical is ready for anything. The bridge settled into the focused quiet that came during crisis situations. Everyone knew their job and did it without needing constant orders. Jake watched the time display count down and tried not to think about what they might find when they reached the Calarian. Pods, 14 hours to cover the distance to Kepler 442, maybe 1 hour to spare. Amy's calculations were correct. It would be close, but Jake had confidence in his crew and his ship. The Defiant had never let him down before, and he did not expect her to start now. Outside the viewport stars stretched into lines as the ship accelerated to its maximum safe speed. Somewhere ahead, 13 people were waiting to die unless someone came to save them. Jake Morrison intended to make sure that did not happen. Zexthara thought she was hallucinating when her pod's proximity sensors started beeping. The small screen showed a large object approaching from the direction of empty space. After floating alone for more than 12 hours, her mind might be playing tricks on her. The air in the pod had become thin and hard to breathe. Each breath took more effort than the last, and her 4 hearts were beating faster to pump oxygen through her blue blood. The life support system was failing just as she had expected, and death would come soon, but the sensor readings looked real. Something big was moving toward her pod with purpose rather than drifting randomly like debris. Zexthara forced herself to focus on the display and tried to identify what kind of ship had found her. The configuration was unmistakable once she got a clear reading. Angular hull plates bolted together in functional rather than elegant patterns. Weapon mounts that looked crude but effective. Engine exhausts that glowed with unrefined fusion fire. Only one species built ships that looked like flying scrapyards held together with determination and hope. Humans.zex single quotes to HA. I felt a mixture of relief and embarrassment wash over her tired mind. Relief because someone had actually come to help when she thought she would die alone in space. Embarrassment because her rescuers were members of the species that Calarians considered barely civilized barbarians. The human ship moved closer with surprising grace for such an ugly vessel. Zexthara could see smaller craft launching from its hangar bays. Rescue shuttles designed to collect the scattered escape pods and bring survivors aboard the main ship. Her communication system crackled to life with a voice, speaking heavily accented but understandable Calarian. The words were pronounced wrong in several places, but the meaning was clear enough. "This is Captain Morrison of the United Earthship Defiant. We are here to help. Prepare for pickup." Zexthara tried to respond, but her voice came out as a weak whisper. The thin air made talking difficult, and she had to concentrate just to form words properly. "This is Commander Zexthara of the Calarian Republic Navy. My life support is failing. Please hurry." The human captain's reply was immediate and reassuring. "We see your condition, Commander. Rescue shuttle is already on approach. Stay calm and try to conserve oxygen." Through her pod's small window, Zexthara watched the human shuttle maneuver into position. The pilot was clearly skilled despite flying what looked like a maintenance vehicle with engines attached. Mechanical arms extended from the shuttle's hull and locked onto her pod with gentle precision. The transfer to the human ship took only a few minutes but felt much longer. Zexthara found herself holding her breath, even though she needed every bit of oxygen her failing life support could provide. When the shuttle finally docked with the main ship, she heard new sounds through the hull. Human voices speaking in their own language with urgency and concern. Footsteps moving quickly along metal corridors. The hiss of airlocks cycling as the rescue shuttle was brought safely inside. When the pod door opened, Zexthara got her first close look at actual humans instead of pictures and diplomatic reports. They were smaller than she had expected, and their skin looked strangely smooth without scales or protective plates. But their eyes showed the same intelligence she had seen in members of other advanced species. Dr. Lisa Bennett was the first human to speak directly to her. The medical officer's hands moved with steady confidence as she checked Zexthara's vital signs and administered emergency treatments. "Commander, can you understand me?" Dr. Bennett asked. Her Calarian was even worse than the captain's, but the concern in her voice was unmistakable. "Yes, I can understand," Zexthara replied. She was surprised by how gentle the human doctor's touch was. Calarian medical training emphasized efficiency over comfort, but Dr. Bennett seemed to care about both. Captain Morrison appeared in the medical bay doorway, and Zexthara got her first look at the human who had ordered his ship to risk everything for strangers. He was older than she had expected, with gray hair at his temples and lines around his eyes that spoke of years making difficult decisions. "How is she, Doctor?" Morrison asked. "Oxygen deprivation and mild hypothermia, but nothing permanent. She should be fine with rest and proper atmosphere." Morrison nodded and then looked directly at Zexthara. His expression was difficult to read, but seemed friendly rather than hostile. "Commander, we are collecting the other pods now. Can you tell me how many crew members were evacuated from your ship?" 13 pods were launched, Zexthara said. Her voice was getting stronger as the medical bay's atmosphere helped her breathe more easily. "But I have not heard from the others for many hours." Their emergency beacons went silent. She saw something change in Morrison's face when she said that. A tightness around his eyes that suggested he understood what silent beacons probably meant. But he did not voice those fears aloud. "We will find everyone we can, Commander. My crew is very good at their jobs?" Over the next several hours, Zexthara watched the humans work with an efficiency that surprised her. The crew moved through the ship with practiced coordination as they brought in pod after pod. Each rescue was treated as a personal mission rather than just another duty to perform. Dr. Bennett and her medical team worked tirelessly to treat survivors whose physiology they had studied but never encountered in person. They improvised treatments and adapted human medical equipment to work with Calarian biology. When conventional approaches failed, they tried creative solutions, until something worked. Chief Engineer Phillips personally supervised the technical teams that examined each pod to determine why some had failed while others kept their occupants alive. He spoke to the machinery like it was a living thing that might respond to encouragement and kind words. Navigator Carter plotted search patterns that maximized their chances of finding pods that had drifted far from the original ejection point. His calculations were precise, but he also seemed to understand that mathematics alone could not account for the chaos of space. Lieutenant Rodriguez coordinated communications between all the rescue shuttles and monitored for any signs of approaching ships. Her voice remained calm and professional even when delivering news that another pod had been found empty. What impressed Zexthara most was how the humans treated each failure. When they opened a pod to find its occupant already dead, the entire crew seemed to take it as a personal loss. They had not known these Calarians and had no obligation to care about their fate. But they grieved anyway. "Your people," Zexthara said to Captain Morrison when he came to check on her progress. "Why did you come here? My species has never shown yours any kindness or respect." Morrison sat down in the chair beside her medical bed and was quiet for a moment before answering. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of deep conviction. "Because that is what decent people do, Commander. We do not abandon anyone to die alone in space regardless of politics or past disagreements." The simple certainty in his words made Zexthara think about everything she had been taught about humans. The diplomatic reports had described them as chaotic and unpredictable, dangerous because they made decisions based on emotion rather than logic, but what she was seeing looked more like a different kind of logic. One based on principles that remained constant, even when circumstances changed. The humans had risked their ship and crew to save people who had never done anything for them, not because they expected rewards or gratitude, but because they believed it was the right thing to do. When the rescue operation was finally complete, Captain Morrison gathered all the survivors in the ship's main meeting room. Of the 13 escape pods, only 9 had contained living crew members. 4 Calarians had died alone in space before help could reach them. Morrison's expression was grim as he delivered the final count. "I am sorry we could not save everyone, Commander. My crew did everything possible, but some of the pods had already lost life support before we arrived." Zexthara looked around at her fellow survivors and saw the same confusion in their faces that she felt in her own mind. These humans had fought time and distance to save complete strangers. They had succeeded beyond any reasonable expectation, yet their captain was apologizing for not achieving the impossible. "Captain Morrison," she said, "you saved 9 lives today when logic said you should save none. My people owe you a debt that cannot be repaid." The human captain's response would stay with her for the rest of her life. "No debt, Commander. This is just what neighbors do for each other." Lieutenant Amy Rodriguez was monitoring the long-range sensors when 3 massive shapes dropped out of hyperspace. The contacts appeared on her screen like predators, materializing from the darkness, and her blood went cold as she read the identification. "Signatures. Captain to the bridge immediately," Amy called over the ship's communication system. Her voice stayed professional, but everyone who heard it knew something bad was happening. Jake Morrison arrived on the bridge 30 seconds later, still pulling on his uniform jacket. The rescued Calarians were resting in guest quarters, and he had been checking on their condition with Dr. Bennett. Now he stood behind Amy's station and studied the tactical display with growing concern. 3 hegemony destroyers, Captain," Amy reported. "They just came out of hyperspace at the edge of the system and are moving this way at high speed." Jake felt his stomach tighten as he looked at the enemy ships on the screen. Each hegemony destroyer was 5 times larger than the Defiant and carried enough firepower to turn his ship into scrap metal. 3 of them together could probably level a small planet. "How long until they reach us?" Jake asked. Navigator Paul Carter ran calculations on his computer and looked up with a pale face. "At their current speed, approximately 40 minutes, Captain." Chief Engineer Tony Phillips had arrived on the bridge and was studying the sensor readings over Amy's shoulder. The older man whistled low under his breath as he saw the size and armament of the approaching ships. "Captain, those are frontline warships," Tony said. "Latest generation weapons and armor. We would not last 5 minutes in a straight fight." Jake nodded and moved to the center of the bridge. His crew was looking at him with expressions that mixed fear and determination. They all knew the odds, but nobody was suggesting they should run away and abandon the Calarian survivors. The communication system crackled to life with a voice speaking accented but clear English. The tone was arrogant and demanding in the way that made Jake want to punch something. "Human vessel, this is Admiral Kraktos of the Hegemony Third Fleet. You are in violation of territorial boundaries and harboring fugitive criminals. Surrender immediately and prepare to be boarded." Jake walked over to the communication station and picked up the microphone. He took a deep breath and tried to keep his voice calm, even though his heart was pounding hard enough to hurt. "Admiral, this is Captain Morrison of the United Earthship Defiant. The people on my ship are rescued survivors, not criminals. They are under the protection of the United Earth Navy." The alien admiral's laughter came through the speakers like the sound of breaking glass. When he spoke again, his voice carried the kind of contempt that made Jake's hands clench into fists. "Protection, Captain Morrison. Your pathetic vessel against 3 of our finest warships. Do you really think you can fight us and win?" Jake looked around at his crew and saw the same determination in their faces that he felt in his own heart. Amy's fingers were already moving across her weapons control panel. Paul was plotting evasive courses. Tony was preparing to give the engines everything they had. "Admiral, I think you misunderstand the situation," Jake said into the microphone. "I am not offering to fight you. I am promising to fight you. If you want these people, you will have to go through us." The communication channel went silent for several long seconds. When Admiral Kraktos spoke again, his voice had lost some of its arrogant confidence. "Captain, you are either very brave or very foolish. Perhaps both, but bravery will not save you from superior firepower. You have 10 minutes to surrender before we open fire." Jake turned off the communication system and looked at his crew. These were good people who had families and lives they wanted to return to. He had no right to ask them to die for strangers who belonged to a species that had never shown humans any respect. "All hands, this is the captain speaking," Jake said over the ship's intercom. "We have hegemony warships approaching, and they want us to turn over the Calarian survivors. Anyone who wants to leave can take a shuttle and head for the outer system. No questions asked and no shame in that choice." He waited for responses, but The bridge remained quiet. Amy continued working on her weapons systems. Paul kept plotting defensive maneuvers. Tony headed for the engine room to prepare for combat. Nobody moved toward the shuttle bays. "Sir, we could try to outrun them," Paul suggested without much hope in his voice. "The Defiant is faster than those big destroyers." Jake shook his head. "We would have to leave the Calarians behind and they would die anyway. Besides, those ships have long-range weapons that could hit us before we reach safe distance." Dr. Bennett's voice came over the intercom from the medical bay. "Captain, the Calarian commander wants to speak with you. She says it is urgent." Jake made his way to the medical bay where Zexthara was waiting with an expression of determination on her scaled features. The alien officer had recovered enough to stand, although she still looked weak from her ordeal in space. "Captain Morrison, you must surrender us to the hegemony," she said without any greeting. "We are grateful for your rescue, but we will not allow you and your crew to die for our sake." Jake studied her face and saw genuine concern for his people, mixed with the kind of resignation that came from accepting an unpleasant fate. "Commander, that is not going to happen. These people are under my protection now." "You cannot fight 3 destroyers and survive," Zexthara said. "The logical choice is to save your ship and crew." "We understand." Jake smiled despite the situation and shook his head. "Commander, you still do not understand how humans think. Logic has nothing to do with this decision." He returned to the bridge where his crew was making final preparations for battle. The hegemony ships were close enough now to appear as visual contacts on the main screen. Dark wedge shapes bristling with weapon ports and missile launchers. "Captain." "Incoming transmission from the hegemony flagship," Amy reported. "Put it through," Jake ordered. Admiral Kraktos appeared on the main screen. The alien looked like a cross between a lizard and an insect with compound eyes that reflected light in unsettling ways. His voice carried the confidence of someone who had never lost a battle. "Your time is up, Captain Morrison. Surrender now or face the consequences of your foolish choice." Jake stood in front of the screen where the alien admiral could see him. Clearly, his crew was at battle stations and ready to fight impossible odds. The Calarian survivors were safe in the medical bay under Dr. Bennett's protection. "Admiral, you seem to think this is about winning or losing," Jake said. "It is not. It is about doing the right thing regardless of the cost. These people needed help, and we gave it to them. Now they need protection, and we will give them that too." The hegemony admiral's compound eyes seemed to focus more intently on Jake's image. "You would sacrifice your entire crew for aliens who care nothing about your fate." "I would sacrifice my entire crew to save one person who needed help," Jake replied. "That is what decent beings do. That is what makes us different from you." Admiral Kraktos cut the communication channel and gave orders to his ships. On the Defiant's tactical display, Jake could see weapon systems powering up and missile tubes loading. The 3 destroyers spread out in attack formation designed to catch his ship in a crossfire. "All hands battle stations," Jake announced over the intercom. "This is going to be rough, but we have been in tough spots before. Remember, we are not just fighting for ourselves today. We are fighting for the idea that nobody should die alone in space." Amy looked up from her weapons console with a tight smile. "Torpedoes armed and ready, Captain. Not that they will do much good against those big ships." Paul had found something on his navigation screen that made him straighten up with excitement. "Captain, I have an idea. There is a debris field about 2 million kilometers from here. Wreckage from some ancient battle. If we could reach it, we might have some cover." Tony's voice came over the intercom from the engine room. "Captain, I can give you 110% power for maybe 20 minutes before the engines overheat. After that, we will be dead in space." Jake nodded and settled into his command chair. The hegemony ships were beginning their attack run, and soon the space around the Defiant would be filled with death. But his crew was ready, and that was all any captain could ask for. Paul set course for that debris field maximum burn. "Amy, prepare to return fire as soon as they shoot at us." "Tony, give me everything those engines have got." The first missiles launched from the hegemony destroyers, and Jake Morrison prepared to show three enemy admirals what humans could do when they had something worth fighting for. The battle lasted 3 hours and became the stuff of legends throughout the galaxy. Captain Jake Morrison piloted the Defiant through the debris field like a man possessed, while his crew performed miracles with weapons and systems that should have failed under such extreme conditions. Lieutenant Amy Rodriguez coordinated the ship's defensive systems with inhuman precision. Every time hegemony missiles locked onto their position, she found a way to break the targeting or hide behind chunks of ancient wreckage. Her fingers danced across control panels as she juggled shield frequencies and electronic countermeasures. Chief Engineer Tony Phillips somehow managed to coax impossible performance from engines that were already running beyond their design limits. When the power couplings started to fail, he bypassed them with spare parts that were never meant to carry that much energy. When the cooling system overloaded, he vented atmosphere from damaged sections to keep the reactors from melting down. Navigator Paul Carter plotted courses through the debris field that no sane pilot would attempt. He found paths between massive chunks of dead starships that were barely wider than the Defiant herself. More than once the ship scraped against twisted metal that could have torn her hull open if Paul's calculations had been off by even a few meters. The humans fought not with superior technology or overwhelming firepower, but with desperate creativity and absolute refusal to give up. They used the debris field like a three-dimensional maze that confused the larger hegemony ships. When conventional tactics failed, they invented new ones on the spot. Jake Morrison personally piloted his ship through maneuvers that pushed both vessel and crew to their breaking points. He flew the Defiant like a fighter craft instead of a heavy cruiser, rolling between massive pieces of wreckage and using destroyed ships as shields against enemy fire. The hegemony destroyers found themselves fighting an enemy that refused to follow the normal rules of space combat. Every time they thought they had the human ship trapped, it would disappear behind cover or perform some impossible maneuver to escape destruction. Admiral Kratos grew more frustrated with each passing hour as his overwhelming advantage failed to produce quick victory. Dr. Lisa Bennett worked frantically in the medical bay to treat crew members injured by the violent maneuvers and battle damage. The Calarian survivors helped as much as they could despite having no training in human physiology. Commander Zexthara held injured crew members steady while Dr. Bennett worked to save their lives. The turning point came when Paul Carter spotted a weakness in the enemy formation. One of the hegemony destroyers had moved too close to a massive piece of wreckage while trying to get a clear shot at the Defiant. Amy Rodriguez saw the same opportunity and armed their most powerful torpedo. Captain, if we can hit that debris at exactly the right angle, we might be able to bring it down on top of their ship, Amy said. Jake Morrison studied the tactical display and saw what his crew had discovered. It would require perfect timing and incredible luck, but it might work. Do it, he ordered. The torpedo streaked through space and struck the ancient wreckage at precisely the right spot. Millions of tons of twisted metal began to shift and fall toward the hegemony destroyer like a slow-motion avalanche. The enemy ship tried to move but was trapped by its own size and the surrounding debris. When the wreckage hit the destroyer's hull, the impact knocked out most of its weapons and left it crippled. The other two hegemony ships suddenly found themselves facing a much more even fight against an enemy that had already proven to be dangerously unpredictable. Admiral Kratos made the decision to withdraw before he lost any more ships. The hegemony fleet retreated to the edge of the system and prepared to call for reinforcements. But by the time additional ships arrived, the Defiant and her passengers were long gone. Jake Morrison limped his damaged ship back toward human space, with hull breaches sealed by emergency patches and engines held together by Tony Phillips' determination and spare parts. When they finally reached Earth, the story of their rescue mission spread like wildfire through the fleet. Commander Zexthara's report to the Calarian High Council created an even bigger sensation in her own government. The idea that humans had risked everything to save people who had shown them nothing but contempt challenged every assumption her species had made about these primitive aliens, the Calarian Council debated for weeks about how to respond to such unprecedented kindness. Some members wanted to dismiss it as an isolated incident that meant nothing. Others argued that any species capable of such selfless behavior deserves serious reconsideration of their status in galactic society. The deciding factor came when other Calarian ships began reporting similar encounters with human vessels. Rescue missions launched without thought of reward or recognition. Medical aid provided to species that had never offered anything in return. Trade agreements negotiated fairly even when humans could have demanded better terms. Within 6 months, Captain Morrison received something no human had ever been granted before: full citizenship in the Calarian Republic and an open invitation to visit their homeworld as an honored guest. The ceremony was broadcast throughout both human and Calarian space, but the real changes went much deeper than diplomatic recognition. The story of the Defiance mission spread to dozens of other species who had written off humans as insignificant primitives. Suddenly, these supposedly barbaric aliens were being seen in a completely different light: the Centauri Confederation opened trade negotiations with Earth for the first time in decades. The Rigel Collective invited human observers to their scientific conferences. Even the aloof vegan empire began responding to diplomatic communications that they had previously ignored. Jake Morrison found himself promoted to admiral and assigned to command the new diplomatic protection fleet. His mission was to patrol disputed regions of space and provide assistance to any vessels in distress regardless of their species or political affiliations. The Defiant herself was repaired and upgraded with the latest technology that Calarian scientists could provide. Her crew received medals and commendations from half a dozen different governments. But Jake always said the real reward was seeing the look of gratitude in Zexthara's eyes when they pulled her from that dying escape pod. Commander Zexthara eventually became admiral of the joint Calarian human fleet that was formed to patrol the border regions where pirates and hegemony raiders operated. She worked closely with Jake Morrison to develop new tactics that combined human creativity with Calarian technology. The partnership between their two species became a model for cooperation throughout the galaxy. Other races began to see that differences in culture and biology did not have to mean permanent hostility. Sometimes the most primitive response was also the most civilized one. Years later, when the Great Galactic Council was formed to address threats that no single species could handle alone, it was Admiral Jake Morrison who stood before the Assembly as humanity's first representative. Beside him stood Admiral Zexthara, as living proof that enemies could become friends when decency overcame prejudice. The humans had pierced more than just the silence of space that day in the Kepler 442 system. They had pierced the barriers of fear and hatred that had kept the galaxy divided for centuries. In doing so, they proved that true strength was not measured in weapons or technology, but in the willingness to help others simply because help was needed. The rescue of 13 Calarian survivors became the foundation story for a new age of galactic cooperation. Children of dozens of different species learned about Captain Morrison and his crew in their history classes. The lesson was always the same. Sometimes the most important victories come not from conquering enemies, but from making friends out of strangers. Sometimes the greatest act of strength is reaching out to help someone who cannot help themselves. And sometimes the most advanced civilizations are the ones that remember the simple truth that no one should ever have to face the darkness alone. The stars themselves seemed brighter after that day when a human ship pierced through the silence and showed the galaxy what it truly meant to be civilized.